Welcome back to Introduction to Making Schematics and PCBs with KiCad. This is part 5, our final video for this series. I'll show you how to do the printing of a PCB on our Voltera V1 printer and the soldering and finishing. This is our Voltera V1 printer and laptop that it's connected to. So I'm going to show you how to get started on the software. For my students, open Voltera by double-clicking on that desktop icon, or go to the R drive and open Voltera from there. The opening screen gives you an option to print, solder, heat, or drill. We're going to go with print. We'll start with a simple board because it doesn't have any existing features. It asks which ink we'll be using. What it's talking about is the ink paste that will make the conductive traces on the board. This is a picture of the conductive ink that it will be using, and each batch, when it's manufactured, is labeled with a certain name. So we go add ink, and then gives the affable alien. So we'll click on that one to say, yes, that's the ink we want to use. After you click add, you have to actually click on that to say, yes, that's the one we want to use. Now we want to load a file. We're going to go down here to ink, say choose the file for the ink. So we'll click on choose and navigate to where our file is. Again, for my students, go into the R drive, scroll down to KiCad folder, and then find your own student folder, in this case Joe Student, and we want to load the name of our file and then the fcu.gbr. .gbr stands for the Gerber file that we made in the last episode. The F stands for front and CU for copper, so this is the front copper layer. So we'll click on that and hit open, or double click on it, and it loads that into, and if you get this problem with something going wrong, let me tell you how to deal with that. The biggest problem is not all Gerber files are separated out or parsed equivalently. So Voltera has come up with a way, if you click on the settings wheel, you can go into the general settings and then make sure this is checkmarked, remotely reformat Gerbers. That way when you try to load the Gerber, it will check online. If it doesn't match the format that this Voltera printer actually needs, it can try to reformat, and that solves most problems. So we'll go ahead and click Save. And we're going to remove that and then just choose it again. So we'll click on there, double click on that this time, and it loads it up just fine. We don't have a file for holes because ours is a surface mount only board, not using through-hole components. So we'll click Next. I love the Voltera system. It's got great images and videos to show what you're looking for. So I'll show you how to clean these calibration switches on the machine, and you can read off here on the side what it is you're supposed to be doing. When we've done that, we click Next. Then it shows you how to clamp the board in place. These are board clamps. You lay them on top of your board. Has some screws that you screw down in place. Click Next. Now it wants you to mount the probe. This is the probe that it uses. Magnetically connects to the control head. So we'll click Next. Now it wants you to click and drag the on-screen circuit to match the location of the clamped board. And it will outline the area of your board. And it says click and drag the on-screen circuit to match the location of the board. So I want to hit the outline button. Then I can move this image to where the board actually is. When that's correct, hit Next. It will probe the height of the board in each of those locations. If you run into a problem where the edge of the board, the edge cuts, is too close, like overlaying the clamps, you're not going to be able to probe the board correctly. So let's go back and I'll show you how to deal with that situation. The problem is because the edge cuts has been included in the Gerber files. So we're going to go in and change our Gerber file to not include the edge cuts layer. Go back and open up KiCad. We're going to open up the PCB editor. Here's our file from the PCB editor window. This time when we go to make our Gerber files, let's go to Fabrication Outputs, Gerbers, and we'll uncheck the edge cuts. Make sure the edge cuts layer is not checked, just the front copper layer. And you can save it over the top of your old file. Just plot that again, saves that. Now close that window, go back to the KiCad Project Manager window and start your Gerber viewer. Once the Gerber viewer is working, open your Gerber job file, reopen that file, and this time you'll see that it just has the front copper traces and pads, no edge cuts. So let's go back to Voltera. The easiest thing is to close out Voltera. restart it again. Again, it will scan for printers. We'll go to Print, a simple board, choose the same ink. This time, when we load our file, we're going to just load the front copper layer. And now you can see it doesn't show the edge cuts, so it shouldn't have a problem with trying to probe that edge cuts layer. We've already cleaned our switches, we've clamped the board in place, we've already mounted the probe. Now we can hit outline again and just move that outline until it matches with where you want to print. And we're ready to go to the next. It gives an estimated time for how long it will take to probe this board, and it's checking the height of each place to make sure that it can correctly dispense the ink in each spot on that board. And as it checks each position, notice how it fills in so you can get a sense of how it's probing the board. And we're ready to go to the next step. Next, we need to prime the conductive ink dispenser until the ink barely comes out. Here you need to know that to use the ink, you need to set it out and let it warm up. The ink is normally stored in the refrigerator. You need to take the ink out and let it warm up for about an hour at least. It doesn't show how you insert the cartridge, but you insert the cartridge, then put the plunger back in, rotate the nozzle until the ink is coming out, back off the nozzle a little bit, wipe it on a tissue, and then you're going to put it in the carriage and have the computer control how much is dispensed. You're going to run it a few times to check and make sure that it's working the way it should. So I've primed the conductor with the ink. It's ready to start printing a test pattern. This shows the test pattern that it's going to print. Next, I've mounted the conductor, ready to start printing. The test pattern printed just fine, so I'm going to wipe away the ink with a tissue, and we're ready to start the real print. So I'll click Start to begin the print. If there's a part of the print that didn't print really well, you can zoom in and select individual tracks or pads. So I'm going to zoom in for an example, and we'll print those two tracks again. So you just click Start, it'll reprint those. Once we finish the print, I'll click Next, remove the conductive ink. Now, each time you print, I'm using disposable nozzles, so I'm going to remove the nozzle. I'm going to back out the plunger by turning it clockwise, then remove that disposable nozzle and discard it, and then put the conductive ink back in the refrigerator. Now, the ink's wet, and we need to cure it, so I'm going to flip the board over and then retighten it on the ledges just above the bed, which heats up, so it will bake the board. Now remember, you have to remove what's called the sacrificial layer. It's the grid on top of the bed of the Voltera printer that has grid lines. It also drills can go through that board, into that board. It's okay, but you need to remove that so that the hot bed doesn't have any obstruction and won't touch the print. Then you can get the print to cure. So now I've flipped that over and we're ready to cure. And it takes about an hour to bake it. The printer does get very hot. Make sure nobody touches it. Make sure it's away from anything flammable. It also gives off some fumes while it's baking. I like to do these prints at the end of the day when I'm ready to head home from work. I'll hit a print and let it run, and then it will automatically, when it's finished, turn off and cool down. You can also see that it'll graph the temperature versus time. So you can see when you turned it on, and over here it shows the temperature ramping up. Welcome back. It's now the next day. The bake is complete. When I load up Voltera, the next thing to click on is solder, and then you have to select the solder paste. This is the correct paste. Next, I will choose the file for solder. It's going to be the same front copper. Go through the quality checks again, clamp the board, mount the probe. I'm going to need to realign it since we flipped the board over. It may be in a different place, so we'll do realign. And the idea is to center that probe tip on the features that are shown on the board. Now you can use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out on the board, and I'll click on Move to Feature. Then I'll move to the next feature and adjust it. This can sometimes seem like a tedious task, but make sure you take the time to do this. You've got to make sure that your probe tip is in the very center of those spots. And then double check by clicking on a specific location, making sure your probe tip hits exactly there. Then it needs to reprobe the height surfaces. Next, we need to prime the solder paste the same way we did the conductive ink paste. So I'll do that and mount that paste on the printer. For dispensing the paste, I don't really want it on the traces, just the pads. So the way to do that is to hold the Shift key down and then highlight the pads you want done. You can select any features that you've printed this way. So now it will just dispense the solder paste onto these pads. So when we're ready to dispense the solder, we'll click Start. And now we're finished with the job. The next step is to add the surface mount components. You're going to use small tweezers to put the components in place and then heat the components to bake them onto the solder. When you're working with these small surface mount device, you're going to need to use these kind of tweezers and be very careful as you open the packages. Make sure you have them in a place that you can dump them out and see them. This shows a view of the completed board where I've placed all the surface mount devices with tweezers onto the board. They're on top of the solder pads. Now the next thing to do is to heat the board. The solder will heat up, melt, and pull that part down and adhere it to the board. So we'll go back to the Voltera main screen and click on Heat. We're going to do a reflow. We're reflowing the same paste, so we click on that. Place the board in the middle of the heated bed. So you need to take off the sacrificial layer, remove the clamps. So we'll go ahead and click Start. The timer shows how much time is remaining, and there's the graph here that ramps up to show you the current temperature. So just be very careful, don't touch the bed or the board while it's reflowing. Reflow is now complete. This shows the temperature graph, how it ramped up and is cooling off. Just wait until it's cooled completely before removing the board so you don't get burned. And this is a view of the final PCB, all printed, mounted, and finished. Thank you for finishing this series of videos on making schematics and PCBs with KiCad. So have fun and my best wishes in making your own PCBs.